London, summer of 1546. The streets are heavy with the smell of smoke and fear. Windows slam shut as the procession passes. Not the slow, defiant march of a condemned heretic, but something stranger. A chair. A woman. She is young, pale, and impossibly still, as if carved from the same stone as the tower that broke her. Her arms hang useless at her sides, shoulders pulled from their sockets, legs too shattered to carry her. The crowd doesn't cheer. They stare as though they are looking at a ghost who hasn't realized she's dead. The chair jolts over the cobblestones, carried by guards who know they are part of something history will not forgive. Ahead, at Smithfield, the stake waits, draped in faggots and gunpowder, ready to turn flesh into ash. The air hums with a kind of silence that comes before a storm. Her name is Anne Askew, born into wealth, schooled in Latin and Scripture, a noblewoman who left her husband, her children, and the safety of privilege to speak truths her country had made illegal. For months, they tried to make her bend. They promised her life, dangled mercy like bread before the starving. They brought friends who had already confessed, priests who spoke of salvation, even the weight of her own broken body, as a weapon against her. When persuasion failed, they dragged her to a place no woman of her rank had ever been, the rack. Wood, iron, rope, and the slow tearing violence of hands turning a wheel. They thought her bones would break before her will. They were wrong. Now she is being carried to fire, not because she was guilty, but because she would not give them names. In the eyes of her enemies, she is stubborn, dangerous, a heretic. In the eyes of history, she is something rarer, proof that the human spirit can outlast the body. And before this day ends, London will watch as the flames try and fail to burn her out of memory. Part 1. Daughter of a Fractured Kingdom. Anne Askew was born into a world where the ground could shift overnight, where a single word in the wrong ear could end in the crackle of firewood at Smithfield, Lincolnshire, around 1521, a land of slow rivers and wide skies, where fields rolled toward the horizon like a green sea, and the houses of the gentry stood solid against the wind. In one such manner, hearth smoke curling into the pale air, a daughter was being raised not for the loom or the cradle, but for the book. Her father, Sir William Askew, was a man of standing and shrewd mind. He believed that knowledge was wealth, and he gave it to his daughter without hesitation. Latin, Scripture, the discipline of thought, tools as sharp as any blade. By the time she was grown, Anne could navigate the language of the scholars and the mysteries of the Bible as deftly as any learned man. It was a rare gift for a woman. It would also be the seed of her undoing, because England itself was tearing apart. Henry VIII, restless and hungry for power, had snapped the cord binding his crown to Rome. Now he stood as head of the English Church, yet beneath the golden canopy of his reign, belief was a labyrinth. The country had not become truly Protestant, nor had it remained purely Catholic. Instead, faith had turned into a minefield where the path to salvation and the path to the stake could look exactly the same until it was too late to turn back. The Act of 6 Articles in 1539 had nailed Catholic doctrine into the framework of royal supremacy, a marriage of opposites that pleased no one and frightened everyone. Today's orthodoxy could be tomorrow's heresy. A friend at supper could be a traitor at dawn. And in this dangerous twilight, Anne's life was already being mapped by hands other than her own. Her father arranged a marriage, as fathers did, to Thomas Kyme, a man whose Catholic faith was as rigid as oak. To him, a wife was meant to follow her husband's creed, to keep her opinions locked behind her teeth. But Anne's mind was not a locked door. It was a burning window thrown wide open. Their home was no sanctuary. It was a battleground dressed as a household. The arguments came like storms, over the saints she would not pray to, over the bread and wine she refused to see as Christ's flesh and blood, over the question of who, if anyone, could stand between a soul and its God. She bore him 2 children, but she could not bear the prison of a faith she did not share. And so she gave him something unthinkable for a Tudor wife, her absence. To leave a husband was scandal. To leave one's children was an unspeakable betrayal in the eyes of the world. To leave both, along with her property, her protection, and her name, to walk openly as a Protestant into the heart of London was not merely defiance, it was a declaration of war. She crossed the threshold of her home for the last time, knowing she had shut the door on safety forever. The London she entered was no place for the careless. Beneath its roar of markets and church bells, another city moved. Narrow alleys where psalms were whispered in the dark, cellars where forbidden books lay hidden beneath sacks of grain, letters smuggled to reformers across the channel. This was the Protestant underground, a river of faith running beneath the cobblestones. And Anne did not step into it quietly. She stepped into it like fire. While other women kept their heads bowed, she stood in the middle of rooms full of men trained in theology, and she held her own. She dismantled the doctrine of transubstantiation. She denied the priest's power to forgive sins. She tore down the saints, not with hammer and chisel, but with words honed to steel. And in Tudor England, steel did not go unnoticed. It was only a matter of time before someone decided it had to be broken. Part 2. The Fire Beneath London. London was not safe, but for Anne Askew, it was the closest thing to freedom she had ever known. The city breathed in layers. At street level, it was the stink of the Thames curling up from the water like a sour ghost, the calls of market criers hawking eels and cloth, the clatter of cartwheels over cobblestone. But underneath, quieter, deeper, ran another current. The murmur of forbidden prayers, the shuffle of feet in a candlelit back room, the creak of a door closing on a meeting that could cost every soul inside their life. In the dim heat above a baker's shop, behind the curtains of a merchant's counting room, and in the smoky upper floors of taverns, the Protestant underground gathered. Men with ink-stained hands bent over Bibles in English. Women kept watch at the windows, ready to scatter at the sound of boots on the stair. Anne did not slide into this world unnoticed. She entered it like a blade drawn from its sheath, sharp, deliberate, gleaming with purpose. She preached when she should have whispered. She argued when she should have nodded. She wielded Scripture not as a comfort, but as a weapon, striking at the roots of Catholic authority. Her words carried a precision that left no room for doubt. Allies leaned closer, enemies marked her face. Her small rented rooms became more than a home, they became a citadel. People came in 2s and 3s, cloaked against the rain, knocking softly. Inside, English Bibles passed from her hands like contraband jewels. On the table, letters lay half-sealed, bound for Antwerp or Geneva, carrying messages to reformers who would know her name without ever seeing her face. Each conversation was an ember, each book a spark. Slowly, the floor beneath London warmed with the fire they were building, a fire no king could see until it burned. But fires do not hide forever. By 1545, her name was already coiling its way through the corridors of power. Bishops in embroidered robes spoke it with a curl of the lip. Courtiers said it in whispers. Counselors said it like a problem to be solved. And Askew was not a cloistered nun, nor a ragged street preacher easy to dismiss. She was a noble woman, educated, articulate, fearless, and she was gathering followers. That made her dangerous. The knock came on a day like any other. Soldiers at the door, questions asked in the tone of men who already knew the answers. Arrest for distributing prohibited books, for preaching without license. Charges with only one likely ending. But her trial was not meant to end in smoke that year. She had friends in high places. Catherine Parr, Queen of England, was linked to her by marriage, and more importantly, by belief. Nobles loyal to the Queen leaned into the King, and Henry, calculating, suspicious, let Anne walk free. Yet freedom tasted of iron. The release was no mercy. It was a test, a reminder. We can touch you whenever we wish. Anne understood. The next time they came, they would not let her go. And somewhere in Whitehall, under the painted ceilings and the echo of soft-booted footsteps, men in velvet robes began to murmur to each other, if Anne Askew would not bend to the law, perhaps she could be made to break upon the rack. Part 3. When the Rack Calls a Lady's Name. June 1546. The Tower of London loomed black against a sky the color of lead. Rising from the Thames like some ancient predator, it seemed less a fortress than a vault for human misery, its stones steeped in the screams of centuries. The air inside was thick with damp and rust, the slow drip of unseen water, the faint iron taste of old blood. The tower had witnessed kings dragged to execution, traitors vanish into darkness, bodies rot and disappear into the earth. But never, in all its grim history, had it seen a noblewoman strapped to the rack, until Anne Askew. Her second arrest had nothing to do with saving her soul. This was politics, sharpened to a killing edge. The Catholic faction at court had grown bold. Henry VIII's health was failing, and the game for succession had already begun. Anne was bait, a lure meant to draw out and destroy the Protestant circle around Queen Catherine Parr. If they could make her speak, they could burn the Queen's allies, perhaps the Queen herself. They tried the velvet glove first. Promises whispered like silk. Freedom, a ship to Antwerp, a quiet life in exile. Priests came with scripture twisted into chains of guilt and obedience, their voices coated with honey. Former friends, already broken, were brought before her, eyes lowered, urging her to yield. Anne listened. Her answer was silence. And so the gloves came off. They led her into a chamber where the walls seemed to lean in, where light pooled on the floor like trapped water. In the center stood the rack, a crude wooden frame, iron rollers at each end, ropes coiled and ready like sleeping vipers. The smell of oil and old sweat clung to the air. Along the walls, other instruments of pain glimmered in the half-light. Pincers, manacles, the whip. They were not just tools. They were a silent chorus whispering what could happen if the rack failed. No woman of her station had ever crossed this threshold. That was the point. The sheer insult of it, they believed, would crush her spirit before the first turn of the wheel. They were wrong. Her wrists and ankles were tied, rough hemp biting into skin. The first turn of the handle drew her body taut. She gritted her teeth. The second turn forced the breath from her lungs. A thin gasp escaped. The third, it came, not as a scream, but as the wet, sickening pop of bone-leaving socket. Shoulders first, then hips, then knees. The human frame was being unmade, joint by joint, with deliberate care. The tower's professional torturer, a man with years of cruelty carved into his face, suddenly froze. His hands fell away from the crank. He muttered something under his breath and stepped back, shaking his head. He would not, could not, continue. Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, silk-clad and perfumed, stepped forward. A man who had dined with the king, who had knelt at the altar, now standing at the rack, his hands closing around the handle like a farmer testing the weight of a plow. He turned it slowly, his gaze locked on her face, hunting for that moment when her will would crack. It never came. Through the red haze of agony, Anne's mind clung to Scripture. She saw not the men in the room, but another figure. Christ on the cross, limbs wrenched, nerves afire, breath stolen by pain. If he could endure, then so could she. Her body screamed, but her soul stood untouched. At last, they loosened the ropes. She collapsed into herself, limbs hanging useless, her legs refusing to bear her. To them, she was now just broken meat. But when they asked for names, her voice came, steady, unbroken, and it said nothing they wanted to hear. Part 4. The trial in the chair. They had broken her body. Now they would try to break her name. The great hall of the court lay in a hush so thick it felt alive. Heat clung to the air, turning every breath into a weight. Sunlight slanted through tall, arched windows, cutting bars of gold across the stone floor. In the light, dust motes drifted like ash, as if the room were already rehearsing the fire to come. Where the accused should have stood was a chair. Anne Askew was carried in by 2 guards and lowered into it with the care one might give to something fragile, not out of mercy, but because her body was already shattered. Her arms dangled useless at her sides, shoulders twisted from their sockets. Beneath her skirts, her legs lay bent and swollen, each movement sending invisible knives through bone and sinew. Yet her face was hewn from something older and harder than pain. The judges sat high above, their robes spilling like dark rivers over the benches. These were the same men who had signed the orders for her torture, now cloaking their brutality in the trappings of law. Behind them, courtiers shifted on polished benches, the scrape of fabric and the occasional cough cutting through the silence. They expected the trial to be an exercise in inevitability. The script already written. Heresy was the charge. Death by fire was the sentence. All that remained was to wrap it in the theater of justice. The clerk read the accusations in a voice meant to sound impartial, denying the presence of Christ in the sacrament, rejecting the authority of priests to forgive sins, preaching without license. In Tudor England, any one of these was enough to drag you to the stake. Together, they were the death knell. When it was her turn to answer, Anne did not plead. She did not beg. She preached. Her voice was not loud, but it carried clear as a winter bell in the thin air, striking the ear with a purity that made some flinch. She spoke scripture from memory, each verse delivered like a stone laid into a wall no fire could breach. She did not simply deny the charges, she dismantled them, pulling apart their logic with the precision of a scholar and the conviction of a prophet. For a moment, the hall stirred. A few eyes dropped to the floor. Others stared, caught between fascination and unease. It was not the speech of a woman defending her life. It was the sermon of one who had already given it up. The verdict was inevitable. Burned alive at Smithfield, the date was set, and the gavel fell like the closing of a tomb. But the weeks before her execution were not silent. The court sent priests daily, hoping to coax her into recantation. They spoke of salvation, of heaven's mercy, of eternal damnation should she persist. Government envoys tried softer chains, exile, a royal pardon, even the promise of seeing her children again, if she would only give them a single name. Her estranged husband was summoned to her cell, perhaps imagining the thought of her children's faces would crack her resolve. He left with her words ringing in his ears, her gaze unshaken. Anne's cell became a pulpit. She dictated poems and meditations, her words smuggled out on scraps of paper hidden in hymns and bread loaves. They spoke not of surrender, but of triumph, not the kind measured in years, but in truth kept at all costs. Every attempt to break her only sharpened her. Her body was in their hands, but her will remained her own. And that was the one thing they could not put to the torch. Part 5. The Woman Who Would Not Burn. July 16, 1546. London awoke under a sky of washed-out blue, the kind that promised heat before noon. From the narrow lanes to the open markets, people whispered of the execution at Smithfield, not because a heretic would burn, but because of who she was. The sound came first, iron wheels rattling over cobblestones, the creak of wood under weight. And then they saw her, a chair, a woman, guards on either side. Anne Askew was borne through the streets like some terrible parody of a royal procession. Her head was upright, though her body could not hold itself. Arms hung useless at her sides, hands pale against the dark folds of her gown. The ropes that had bound her to the rack had left scars. The rack itself had left her unable to walk. Yet her eyes, sharp, unwavering, scanned the crowd as though she were the one judging them. Smithfield had been prepared for the spectacle. The stake rose from a mound of kindling stacked high and tight, the wood dry enough to catch in moments. Around its base, soldiers formed a ring of steel, not to protect her, but to hold back the crowd. For there were those who came not to jeer, but to watch in silence, Protestant sympathizers who dared not speak. At the center, they lifted her from the chair. Ropes bound her to the stake so she would not collapse into the fire too soon. The executioners tied small bags of gunpowder around her body, the Tudor version of mercy, meant to explode and end her suffering swiftly. But no one here believed mercy was truly the intent. A priest stepped forward, the final offer hanging in the air like the last breath before a plunge. Recant and live. Anne's reply was steady, her voice carrying through the square. I am not come hither to deny my lord and master. The torch touched the wood. Flame crawled upward, licking at the dry bundles, gaining speed, turning from gold to white. The crowd flinched as the first rush of heat rolled outward. Through the roar of the fire, her lips moved, words lost in the crackle, but clear in intent. Prayer. Witnesses swore her face did not twist in fear, that her gaze remained fixed somewhere beyond the smoke. The gunpowder bags exploded in sharp, violent bursts, sending embers and fragments into the air. Spectators stumbled back, shielding their faces. But when the smoke thinned, they saw she was still upright, still bound, still present. The fire climbed higher, swallowing her gown, blackening her skin, until the figure that had been Anne Askew was lost in a pillar of flame. When it was done, the crowd did not cheer. They dispersed in silence. The image of a young woman in a chair being carried to her death burned into their minds as deeply as the fire had burned her body. Her enemies thought they had erased her. Instead, they had forged her into a martyr. Her writings, smuggled from the Tower, spread across England and into Europe. In Protestant homes, her name was spoken like a psalm. In secret gatherings, her courage was held up as proof that faith could outlast even the rack, even the fire. Anne Askew, the woman who would not burn, had left the world in ashes, and in doing so, had lit a flame her enemies could never extinguish.